Moving to our first section, defining racism. So, I like this meme a lot. So, racism is definitely something that a lot of us struggle with understanding. And it's very intentional that we struggle with understanding racism. So I sent out some of the pre-readings and homeworks I sent out was just review a lot of the racial disparities and racial outcomes, disparities and outcomes that we experience in this country. So hopefully we understand now that race is in this country and in many other countries is a major predictor of outcomes in all U.S. systems. And there's a lot of predictors too, as well as gender and class and things like that. And a lot of people, there's an argument between which one's the biggest one, race and class. In my opinion, race is far beyond any of them, but I know other people would argue that. But we need to understand that it is a major predictor of outcomes in all of these U.S. systems. If you're a Black, Indigenous person of color, you are more likely to have less wealth and in relation to white people have less wealth. You're more likely to have a shorter life. You're more likely to be living in poverty, to go to underfunded schools. There's a survey recently, a study that showed that white schools on average gets $23 billion more a year than schools that are diverse schools or schools primarily in communities of color. You're more likely to experience housing discrimination, to get bad loans, to get denied loans. You're more likely to experience bad things on every part of our criminal justice system, more likely to be pulled over, arrested, experience brutality, more likely to be convicted by a jury, more likely to get longer sentences by a judge, more likely to not qualify for parole and things like that. All based on your skin color. You're more likely to not have, adequate health care. You're more likely to be unemployed, more likely to not have access to healthy food in your communities. And I think the biggest one we're seeing is you're more likely to die from COVID. This is a new study. Pew just came out with these, I think it was like maybe yesterday or a couple of days ago, just came out with these recent studies right now showing that that the death rates, well, this is the contagious races, but also it's very similar death rates, and Black and Latino or Latinx people are exponentially experiencing, deaths and cases. And that's not, a couple of people are beginning to try to explain that that's just like lifestyles. That's not lifestyles. That's the direct result of 400 years of racist policies and white supremacy and the outcomes of that. And then on that same end, we need to understand that all of this is happening. Many white people don't even know it's happening. The typical white person lives in a community that's 77% white. 75% of white people in this country do not have any friends of color, or if they do, it's not the kind of friend that's going to be real with them about racism. And that, we're going to talk about a lot of policies. That's very intentional. That's not, white people didn't choose to segregate. It was policies that created this segregation. But half of the white, there's all these studies, that are coming out that white people, some of them are like half, some of them are majority, simple majorities, but a lot of white people think that white discrimination is just as bad, if not worse, than discrimination against Black, Indigenous people of color. So we're and that's a direct result of just being removed of this. And then we flip the other side and we look at, who does have the power, who does have the wealth. These are statistics that Dr. Robin DiAngelo, wrote the White Fragility book. She put together after the 2016 election. She talked about the majority of people, billionaires, millionaires, are white. Most of the wealth is in white people's hands. Congress is controlled by white people. Governors, who decides decisions in our military, are who are most of our presidents. Who gets to decide what we watch on TV, what books get published, what news gets covered, what music is produced, who teaches our children, full time, these are all, majority, just majority white, positions of power right now. So we have to understand this. So understanding this, and then if you want to understand, like, well, how did this happen? These dynamics happen. So, a lot of people start with these simple definitions about racism. Webster, in Oxford Dictionary about racism and white supremacy. And they both start, all these definitions are basic dictionary definitions start the same way: a belief that race is, primary determinant of human traits, a belief that white people are superior. But if you look at, all this stuff isn't happening because a bunch of people believe white people are superior. There's so much more that's causing all of this. And you also have to understand that these definitions, although a lot of people use these definitions to avoid, having real conversations about racism, but these definitions were created from white institutions. These are white institutions that are analyzing what racism means for, non-white people. So naturally, they're not going to be, that strong. So then we have to start, looking to other people, looking through social sciences, to the anti-racism, activists. And Scott Woods is an amazing author, poet, I believe in Columbus, Ohio. He was the first person that could really, his definition really opened up my eyes to this idea of what, what really is racism beyond just a belief. And he wrote this quote that I'll read. The problem is that white people see racism as conscious hate, when racism is bigger than that. Racism is a complex system of social and political levers and pulleys set up generations ago to continue working on behalf of whites at other people's expense. Whether whites know, like it or not, racism is an insidious cultural disease. It is so insidious that it doesn't care if you're a white person who likes black people. It's still going to find a way to affect how you deal with people who don't like you. Yes, racism looks like hate, but hate is just one manifestation. Privilege is another, access is another, ignorance is another, apathy is another, and so on. So while I agree with people who say no one is born racist, it remains a powerful system that we're immediately born into. It's like being born into air. You take it in as soon as you breathe. It's not as cold that you get. It's not a cold that you can get over. There's no anti-racist certification class. It's a set of social, economic traps and cultural values that are fired up every time we interact with the world. It is a thing you have to keep scooping out of, the boat of your life to keep from drowning in it. I know it's hard work, but it's the price you pay for owning everything. So we have a couple comments on the side. I saw a statement about the social contract from The Voice and the lady in Minnesota, and it was powerful. Actually, we're going to watch the show. We're going to watch that video later on for sure, and it's insanely powerful. Regina says the cost is $75 to $175 for Rob D'Angelo to speak at an event through Eventbrite called "See the Racial Water." It's a half-day event. Awesome. Yeah, check out Eventbrite. If you go to their website, it's probably going to be one of the ones that pop up, but. Can we take down the SAT, a test created to prove white people are smarter than everybody else? And guess what? Their creation proves the point that they wanted to craft. For sure, yeah, we're gonna have a whole section later on about the SAT test. The SAT was created by eugenists, and it's created specifically to bring white people, score white people higher, we're gonna dive a lot more into that for sure. Not for this class though, but so I'm going to play real quick. Ibram Kendi. So he's a great author. He wrote Stand from Beginning, this great book about racial history of racial ideas. He also recently wrote this book of how to be an anti-racist, and it's a great starting point for when you're just getting started. Do understand that the people that have been working in this for decades, they do have some issues with some things, and it's a mixed reviews. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but overall, it's a great starting point. So he came on, I think I forget what show he's on, but he's talking about, this is back when Trump tweeted the 4 progressive women in the House, AOC, Presley, Rashida, and Ilhan Omar, when they were speaking out against Israel's policies towards Palestinians, and he tweeted out that they all need to go back to their own country, even though they're all U.S. citizens. So they had a show. Democrats. Okay. Was essentially. Sorry, I had the timing out, but I don't see the timing anymore. So we're try to start. Right about there. Okay.
Director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University in Washington, D.C. He's made the trip to join us at the table here in New York. Good morning. Good to see you.
Morning.
Professor Kendi. Take us to the history about, go back to where you came from. Why is that considered a racist statement? I know it made a lot of people cringe when you said it.
Well, in the 19th century, there were many, many reformers, racial reformers, who thought that the way to solve the race problem, the Negro problem, was to essentially send back all free blacks. And that started with Thomas Jefferson, his Notes of the State of Virginia, which was published in 1787 and went all the way up to Abraham Lincoln.
And it's never said about Caucasians or white people of European descent, is it, ever?
It is not, because it's assumed that this is their country. And so where would they go back to?
Yeah.
But people of color, it's assumed that this is not their country.
As we reported, some of the president's supporters have called his tweets inappropriate, not racist. What do you say to that?
Well, first, I'd say there's no such thing as not racist. There's racist and anti-racist. And racist ideas suggest that there's something wrong or right, superior or inferior about a particular group. It suggests that there's something inherently normal about white Americans, that Americans are white and whites are Americans. And his idea suggests that somehow people of color are not American, and that's deeply racist.
But Professor, I heard one of his supporters say they're not racist because in the tweets he never mentions race. So how can it be? So I heard someone say he never mentions race. How can it be considered racist?
So poll taxes, grandfather clauses, these were voting suppression bills that are widely considered by Americans today to be racist, but there were no racial language in them. You don't have to have racial language in an idea or even in a policy for it to be racist. It's about what its outcome. Are you suggesting that there's something wrong with a particular group? Or is it creating inequity? That's the true measure of whether something is racist.
What role do Republicans play in sort of checking the president about these comments? You hear them say it's unacceptable, it's divisive, it's, people are frustrated, but some of them are not really calling out this behavior as racist. What role do they play in sort of helping move this conversation forward or get a better understanding of how our president can say that and some people really feel like that's not offensive?
I think Republicans should play the same role as all Americans, and that is to identify racism when they see it, and to say that America is not going to stand for it. And this is a bipartisan issue. This is an issue that cuts across lines, either we're a nation of immigrants, either we're a nation where everyone is included, or we're a nation of white people. And I think we have to decide, and Republicans need to decide, what type of nation are they going to stand up for?
The White House says the president has repeatedly condemned racism and bigotry in all forms.
So every group of racists in American history have condemned bigotry and racism in all forms, except their form, right? So slaveholders condemned it, segregationists condemned it, mass incarcerators condemned it. They all condemn it, but they all deny their own racism. That's essential to racism itself.
Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has come under fire for some of the remarks she made that she said people say some anti-Semitic and divisive things. Should she be criticized? Do you see the comparison between her remarks and what the president said as the same?
I do not.
Why?
She was very specific in criticizing the policies of a country. In this case, the country was Israel. Mm-hmm. Trump has specifically criticized racial groups of people. When he said that Mexicans are rapists, when he said that black people, that a trait of blacks is laziness. This is a condemnation of a racial group of people. That is effectively racism. When we criticize a country's policies, that is not, when you criticize Israeli policies, that's not anti-Semitic, but when you say there's something wrong with Jews, that is, and I haven't heard her say that.
Can you write racist things and say racist tweets and not be a racist?
What you do in terms of what you say, what policies you support, determines whether you're being racist or anti-racist. So no, if you say things that are racist, you're racist. Just like if you say things that are anti-racist, the next minute you're being an anti-racist. What we do is effectively who we are in that moment.
And the people that don't criticize them, do you criticize those remarks? Are they racist? Because I've heard people say, well, I like his policies. I don't like that he said that, but I like some of his policies. So when you have a politician who is mass producing and circulating racist ideas as the some ones I just described, saying that immigrants from the South are criminals, but never says anything about immigrants from Europe or even the North,
when you have someone who says these things and you don't challenge them, you're effectively supporting them yourself. You're effectively being racist yourself.
All right, Ibram, Kendi, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
All right. So defining what is racist. So, Ibram Kendi said some really great points. Really point I really like that he's really bringing, he's focusing a lot of, I'll read this quote real quick. Racist is not a fixed term. It's not identity. It's not a tattoo. It's describing what a person is doing in the moment. People change from moment to moment. Really like that idea, because I think we kind of hide behind, if we're racist, a bad person for life. And in reality, I mean, we're just, it's what you're doing in the moment, what actions happening, what policies that's happening, whether it's racist or not racist. But to kind of, to define racism in some general terms. So these are two definitions that have kind of appeared over the last couple decades. One of them you see a lot. Racism is systems of advantage and oppression based on race. So that's a nice kind of like simple definition. And that next one is racism is prejudice and institutional power. So this came from, I'm spacing the author, but it came out in the 70s. And this is a really important definition. A lot of people argued against this definition with the, they talk about, because a lot of it comes from, whether black people, is there reverse racism? Can black people be racist? And the idea behind this is racism isn't just hatred. It's not just prejudice or discrimination. It's something bigger. It's something about tapping into the last 400 years of white supremacy and the outcomes of that, and your actions playing off of that. For example, black people can be, can support, anti-blackness, can support white supremacy, like cops and black cops with guns, black politicians that make, racist policies. Ben Carson right now in the HUD is doing, some really horrible anti-black policies in HUD. But the idea of institutional power, we're talking about something bigger. We're talking about, things like black people can't create a criminal justice system that is based on white criminality. They can't herd white people into poor, concentrated, into poor ghettos of concentrated poverty and create policies to keep them in there. They can't create a racial wealth gap where black people have 16 times the amount of wealth than white people. That's what we're talking about when with institutional power. We're talking about these centuries of white supremacy and the outcomes. So I really think, a lot of times, people will argue and stuff. I think this definition is worth, fighting for. It's important to understand it, because if you remove that away, then racism is just someone being a jerk, and then we can just get past that easy. But it's so much more than just, hatred and prejudice. And then what makes something racist is it has an inequity, has outcomes of inequity and discrimination, of harm disproportionately towards a marginalized race, or suggesting or implying something's wrong with a marginalized race. And this is regardless with if that person is like a good person or a bad person or nice, we think like nice, can't equate racism. There's a lot of nice people that commit racist acts and support racism. It doesn't matter about good or bad intentions. It matters about the outcome. A lot of times we're like, well, he had good intentions, but the outcome is really what matters. A great example of since we started seeing, school shootings, since Columbine, we've seen the uptick in police in schools. And we know through what we call the school to prison pipeline, it's analysis of how, children of color are treated in schools. And we know that they're more likely to be, suspended and expelled and brutalized by, cops in schools than their white classmates for doing the same actions, like 3 to 4 times more likely in a lot of these cases. So even though this, the idea of putting police in schools was about, protecting our kids, it came from a good place. It had good intentions. The outcome is children of color, students of color are going to be, are going to be more brutalized by these police. So we have to, really pay attention to the outcomes of this, because many times, a lot of these racist outcomes it came from initiatives that did not, had no intentions to be racist. And that's, we're going to talk a lot more about these least in that, towards the end of this class in the last section. And also, regardless if a person identifies as a racist, a lot of people say, well, you have to identify as a racist to be a racist and to understand racism and stuff. A lot of people don't understand racism, but that doesn't change the fact that their outcomes can be very racist. And then we also have to understand about like things like complicity and complacency. With racism. So a lot of white people, there are a lot of white people that try to say clever ways to say Black lives don't matter, like all lives matter, blue lives matter, all these different things. But then there's but a lot of white people they may repeat the hashtag, they may have the signs in the yards and all that stuff. I mean, no one's saying, they're not saying Black lives don't matter, but at the same time, they're complicit and complacent with systems that devalue criminal lives. So they're supportive of criminal justice systems, or they call the cops in situations they shouldn't, or school, they send their kids to the best schools, knowing that best school was created from centuries of racial segregation, voting for racist candidates. So we have to understand the complicity and complacency. Complicity is when we unconsciously, consciously or unconsciously, support or benefit racist systems, and complacency is when we know something's racist. When we know that there's racism in our police, but we don't do anything about it. So that's where a lot of white support for racism comes, not directly from white people, necessarily causing these problems, but being complicit and complacent with a lot of these problems as well. So we have a question from Regina. We can still perpetuate fear of the Black body, especially the Black male body, as powerful, as dangerous, and that is part of what leads to Black children getting suspended more, sent to juvenile detention, and adults, and quick to physically accelerate situations where they would not with white students. And we watch Black people like hawks, and when someone finally does something wrong, we say, "Ha, I knew it." For sure, yeah, a lot of that. I mean, we're going to dive deeper in different, in classes, but a lot of that is we have this idea of Black criminality that's happened since, it's been around for centuries, and it's been ingrained into us, into these racial biases that make us react differently, and be more suspicious. And even, I appreciate your last comment, because we over police Black communities, and then when there's more crime, we say, look at these statistics, but there's more crime because you're over policing them. Thank you for posting that. All right, so we'll show another video about 5 things. So this is a Franchesca Ramsey. She does the MTV Decoded series, or at least I don't know if they're still doing it or not. And I'll be honest, she's kind of cheesy. I think their audience is meant to be a younger audience, but her messages and her videos are so spot on. You just kind of have to work through the cheesiness a little bit. I'm gonna play this video just talking more about types of racism.
I've got a challenge for you. Try talking about racism with your friends, family, or coworkers, and get ready to watch people squirm. So let's push through the discomfort. Don't worry, you can do it. We're going to talk about racism.
Well, the dictionary defines racism as the hatred or intolerance of another race or races.
Well, yes, but racism's a little more complicated than that. The dictionary offers a very simple explanation, because it's just the dictionary. If you want to understand racism, you need to talk sociology. And sociology explains racism as a combination of prejudice and power.
Well, isn't that just convenient? Let's just ignore what the dictionary says.
No, we're not ignoring the dictionary, just going a little deeper. Think of it this way. If your car breaks down, you don't look up car in the dictionary to try and fix it. You go to a mechanic. So when it comes to getting to the nitty-gritty of understanding how racism works, I say we should probably defer to sociologists, because, they study how people, organizations, and institutions work. It's kind of their job. So here are 5 things everyone should understand about racism. talking about racism is so exhausting. It's like no matter what I do or what I say, someone's gonna call me a racist. Good people can unintentionally say and do racist things. Racism isn't just burning crosses and racial slurs. It's not always a conscious hatred or dislike. People automatically associate saying something racist with being a bad person. And while we can agree that being racist is bad, good people can say racist things or just wind up supporting racist institutions and practices without even realizing it. Oh, so now it's my fault if I accidentally do something. We're not playing the blame game here, but accidents can still be hurtful. It's important to remember that intent isn't the issue, it's the impact. Like if I accidentally step on your toe, it's an accident, but it still hurts. I can't just pretend that I didn't step on your foot. I have to acknowledge it, say that I'm sorry, and be more careful with my big ass feet.
If you want to get technical, there's really no such thing as race. We are all the human race. It's a social construct.
Race is a social construct, but that doesn't mean racism isn't real. A social construct is a category, perception, or idea created and developed by society, and then it's applied to individuals or groups. So yes, we're all part of the human race, but the human race did this funny thing where they categorized everyone based on skin tone and regions. Even though social constructs are made up, they're still real. I mean, money is a social construct. Fundamentally, it's just a piece of paper, but it still keeps people up at night and has a huge effect on our day-to-day lives. Marriage, fashion, good and evil, they're all social constructs, but they're still real things. The same is true for race.
White, black, pink, purple, polka dots. I don't know why we need all of these labels. Let's just not see race. Just see everyone the same.
Colorblindness is not going to fix racism. It's a good idea in theory, but ignoring race is not going to solve racism. Race isn't the problem. Treating people differently based on race is the problem. It's okay to see my race. I mean, it's kind of hard to ignore how someone looks. There's nothing wrong with seeing our differences. Our differences make us kind of cool.
Okay, but when are we going to talk about reverse racism?
Reverse racism is not a thing.
I've been bullied, beaten up, and called all sorts of names in my lifetime, and you're going to tell me that's not racism?
Whoa, that sounds awful. I'm sorry, none of that stuff is okay. But those are examples of racial prejudice, not racism. That's because racism isn't just about individuals. It's about institutional power. Racial prejudice is not cool, but when a person of color discriminates or stereotypes a white person because of their race, in the United States, they don't have the institutional power to back them up and say that those feelings are okay. Institutions are things like schools, government, the military, corporations, and our justice system. All of these things shape how people of color are treated as a group and as individuals. That's because racism is not just on a person-to-person basis. It's big picture things, like people with traditionally Latino or Black-sounding names having a harder time getting job interviews, even when they have the same qualifications as white people applying for the same job. Or people of color facing harsher prison sentences for petty crimes in comparison to white criminals. It's also harder for people of color to get home loans, on top of housing discrimination that often keeps them out of predominantly white neighborhoods. This is how individual feelings about people of color are supported by institutional power. Prejudice of any kind isn't okay, but it's important to understand that prejudice and racism aren't the same thing.
Huh. I never thought about it like that.
Well, you are not the only one. Racism is complicated and overwhelming to think about, even for me. But understanding what racism is and what it isn't is the first step in fighting against it. So what are some misconceptions that you've heard about?
All right, so hopefully that wasn't too cheesy for y'all, but yeah, some really good points that she makes. But also, whenever we're talking about racism, you're never, I'm sure a lot of people have had this conversation, that comes up in a lot of conversations. Are all white people racist? And it's a tricky conversation. It's not a conversation I would really recommend, to be honest. We're going to talk more about white and whiteness in next class. But white was created in 1700 in Virginia as a legal status, a privilege to reinforce racism and oppression for Black people. It had very little to do with the color of the skin. A lot of people that had white color skin weren't, like Irish and Jewish, weren't considered white for a long time. So the idea of white whiteness is ingrained in racism. So technically, yes, anyone identifies white, has that, but it's, if anyone's been a part of that conversation, it doesn't go very well, because essentially what people hear is all white people are bad, and it derails the conversation. So instead, when we're talking about racism, it's more important to talk about how white people are intentionally, unintentionally participate and benefit from racist systems. It's more about talking, stay focused about racist actions and not people, kind of focus on what the policies, what are the actions, kind of avoid that. And then a big thing, we're going to talk a lot more about this throughout the course, but about the idea of calling in versus calling out. Like when we call people out, on social, a lot of times, like on social media, in front of people, all the times, is it public, it's shaming, people get defensive, they don't want to hear what you have to say. When calling in is like, when instead, sometimes you want to call out when you want to like hold a line, or when that person's not going to change, but other people, around them need to, it could be a teachable moment for them. But if you want to change someone's behavior, you call in. That's more of like, you send them an email, call them up, say, hey, can we, what that thing you said, can we talk about it? Can we, over a cup of coffee, can we, have a phone call, things like that. So Beverly Daniel Tatum, she wrote "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Cafeteria?" She's got this great quote. I'm going to read the first, part of it. Another provocative question I'm often asked is, "Are you saying all whites are racist?" When asked this question, I again remember that white teacher's response, and I'm conscious that perhaps the question I'm really being asked is, "Are you saying all whites are bad people?" The answer to that question is, of course not. However, all white people, intentionally or unintentionally, do benefit from racism. A more relevant question is, what are white people as individuals doing to interrupt racism? And then we're gonna play another video. No, there's a lot of videos. I mean, there's a lot of videos for this class. Other classes are going to be, not so many videos, but they're just having to find a lot of great videos around this stuff. But Jace Move is this really great activist up in New York. He's a great person to follow on social media. But he does this really great a short video about how to actually tell someone that they sound racist.
Race, the final frontier. No matter what channel you watch, no matter what feed you aggregate, it seems like everybody everywhere is talking about race right now. And when everybody everywhere is talking about race, that means sooner or later you're going to have to tell somebody that they said something that sounded racist. So you need to be ready and have a plan in place for how to approach the inevitable "that sounded racist" conversation. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. The most important thing that you've got to do is remember the difference between the "what they did" conversation and the "what they are" conversation. Those are two totally different conversations, and you need to make sure that you pick the right one. The "what they did" conversation focuses strictly on the person's words and actions and explaining why what they did and what they said was unacceptable. This is also known as the "that thing you said was racist" conversation, and that's the conversation that you want to have. The "what they are" conversation, on the other hand, takes things one step further and uses what they did and what they said to draw conclusions about what kind of person they are. This is also known as the "I think you are a racist" conversation. This is the conversation you don't want to have, because that conversation takes us away from the facts of what they did and the speculation about their motives and intentions, and those are things you can only guess at, you can't ever prove, and that makes it way too easy for them to derail your whole argument. And that is the part that's crucial to understand. When you say "I think he's a racist," that's not a bad move because you might be wrong. That's a bad move because you might be right. Because if that dude really is racist, you want to make sure you hold him accountable and don't let him off easy. And even though intuitively it feels like the hardest way to hit him is just run up on him and say, "I think your ass is racist," when you handle it that way, you're actually letting him off easy, because you're setting up a conversation that's way too simple for him to derail and duck out of. Just think about how this plays out every time a politician or a celebrity gets caught out there. It always starts out as a "what they did" conversation, but as soon as the celebrity and their defenders get on camera, they start doing judo flips and switching it into a "what they are" conversation. "I have known this person for years, and I know for a fact that they are not a racist, and how dare you claim to know what's inside their soul just because they made one little joke about watermelon tap dancing and going back to Africa. And then you try and explain that we don't need to see inside their soul to know that they shouldn't have said all that about the watermelon. And you try to focus on the facts of the situation, but by then it's too late because the what they are conversation is a rhetorical Bermuda Triangle where everything drowns in a sea of empty posturing until somebody just blames it all on hip-hop and we forget the whole thing ever happened. Don't let this happen to you. When somebody picks my pocket, I'm not going to be chasing them down so I can figure out whether he feels like he's a thief deep down in his heart. I'm going to be chasing him down so I can get my wallet back. I don't care what he is, but I need to hold him accountable for what he did. And that's how we need to approach these conversations about race. Treat them like they took your wallet and focus on the part that matters, holding each person accountable for the impact of their words and actions. I don't care what you are. I care about what you did.
I love that last part about, I'm not going to run down someone that picked my pockets. Like, make sure that, they know that they're a thief, and that's ultimately like, we're not trying to, that's where the conversation of trying to call people racist is tough. And when it's so much easier to try to, and more effective to focus on the actions and behaviors and policies and things like that. And you look at, I really love this chart. They've actually adapted this chart several times, but the idea is kind of show you, like, a lot of times we pay most of our attention to this top part, like the, racist jokes and KKK and these, alt-right stuff. And that's important. We need to, like, pay attention to these, and confront this. And at the same time, these are all the other things that oftentimes, go hidden that we need to start focusing on calling out or calling in and confronting as well. So, right. And then there's a concept about non-racist versus anti-racist. This is the idea. I love this quote by Angela Davis: "In a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist." And this is the idea that like a lot of, it's not enough just to not participate in racism. If you're non-racist, you're not going to use racial slurs. You may show up to some rallies, but you're really not going to confront people. You're not going to work on, dismantling policies or work on, equality at work or talk to your family members. An anti-racist, though, that's someone who's actively, is looking to dismantle racism, is looking to kind of break down, looking to, confront people and educate people, bring, making sure their work has policies of equity, making sure, there's different ways to actually confront it. So that's the biggest goal, is how do we get people, from a non-racist platform to the anti-racist and recruit people to start actually, working on dismantling racism. And that brings me to two deviations. If you have read How to Be an Anti-Racist book by Ibram Kendi, it's a really great book. It's a really great starting point. But there is kind of two deviations from the philosophy, the anti-racism philosophies from the last decades, and from people like Angela Davis and Dorothy Roberts and Beverly Tatum has been kind of working on this. And one of them, and I think it's fine either way you want to do. I think you have to make a choice. And I'll explain both positions, but one of them is Ibram Kendi removes the non-racist category, where he talks about there's either racist or anti-racist, and I believe he did that because he wants to put pressure on the non-racist people, where they need to pick or choose the side. They need he wants to kind of push these people towards anti-racist, but I do think there is value in having, a lot of people think there's value having that non-racist category where you could, because it can help identify. You're like, oh, that's great, you decided. I have a friend that decided not to use the N-word anymore. That's great. I'm glad he's not doing that, but he's not exactly dismantling anything. It's not like he's confronting others from not using the N-word. So it's some people see the value of having that in-between category to kind of push them towards anti-racist. And the other point, he removes the institutional power in the racism category. The racism equals power plus prejudice, and he does this. He's pretty clear about why he does that. He wants to hold Black people who push racism accountable. Black politicians who make push racist policies and things like that. And a lot of people would counter with that. Again, they're supporting anti-Blackness. They're supporting white supremacy, but at the same time, a lot of people will argue about they still don't have that institutional power to really do what's happening to them, and a lot of times that can open up the debate on reverse racism. So we're gonna watch another video, quick video on reverse racism, kind of just give some more context to that.
Half of Americans believe discrimination against white people is as big a problem as discrimination against people of color. Some people call this reverse racism. But here's the thing. If racism were reversed, that would mean racism wouldn't exist in the first place. By calling discrimination against white people reverse racism, you're also acknowledging the power dynamic and saying that white people are the primary upholders of racism, which actually is true. That can't be reversed unless hundreds of years of systemic oppression are erased. White people can experience prejudice and discrimination from people of color, but they do not experience racism. Let's break that down. Racial prejudice typically starts with a belief in stereotypes about groups of people. Racial discrimination is all about actions and unfair treatment based on prejudice. And racism is a form of discrimination based on skin color and ethnic origin. It's kept alive through power and institutional reinforcement. In the United States, prejudice towards people of color is still supported by our most powerful institutions, which means racism is still very much alive. It didn't magically disappear because we have a Black president. Black people, for example, experienced 250 years of slavery in the United States and 100 years of legalized discrimination with Black codes and Jim Crow. In the years to follow, legal discrimination still continued in the form of housing discrimination, job discrimination, no positive representation on television, the war on drugs, mass incarceration, the school-to-prison pipeline, stop and frisk, and so much more. So when things like affirmative action, BET, and Black Lives Matter pop up, these things are there in an effort to level the playing field, not to tip the scale the other way. If white people experienced racism, they would have to undergo hundreds of years of legal oppression, just like people of color still do. White people can experience discrimination in many ways, and it's not okay. But racism just isn't one of them.
And we'll do one more quick video about reverse racism. This is Aamer Rahman. He's a stand-up comedian, but he does a really quick bit that kind of elaborate on what it would take to actually do reverse racism.
A lot of people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people say this to me. Hey, Aamer. Hey, you get on stage, you make your jokes about white people, you say white people this, white people that. What if I did something like that, huh? What if I got on stage and I said, yeah, black people are like this, Muslims are like that. You'd probably call me a racist, wouldn't you? And I say, yeah, I would. Yeah, you should never do that. That's bad for your health. They're like, well, you do that, Aamer. You do that. You get on stage, you make your jokes about white people. Don't you think that's a kind of racism? Don't you think that's dun dun dun? Reverse racism. I said, no, I don't think that's reverse racism. Not because I think reverse racism doesn't exist, right? If you ask some black and brown people, they'll tell you flat out, there is no such thing as reverse racism. I don't agree with that. I think there is such a thing as reverse racism. And I could be a reverse racist if I wanted to. All I would need would be a time machine, right? And what I'd do is I'd get in my time machine, I'd go back in time to before Europe colonized the world, right? And I'd convince the leaders of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Central and South America to invade and colonize Europe, right? Just occupy them, steal their land and resources, set up some kind of like, I don't know, trans-Asian slave trade where we exported white people to work on giant rice plantations in China. Just ruin Europe over the course of a couple of centuries, so all their descendants would want to migrate out and live in the places where black and brown people come from. But of course, in that time, I'd make sure I set up systems that privilege black and brown people at every conceivable social, political, and economic opportunity. White people would never have any hope of real self-determination. Every couple of decades, make up some fake war as an excuse to go and bomb them back to the Stone Age and say it's for their own good because their culture is inferior and just for kicks. subject white people to colored people's standards of beauty, so they end up hating the color of their own skin, eyes, and hair. If, after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of that, I got on stage at a comedy show and said, hey, what's the deal with white people? Why can't they dance? That would be reverse racism.
All right, and the last point I'm going, or I think one of the last points I'm going to make about racist ideas. This is another Ibram Kendi. This is his other book, Stamped from the Beginning. A really great book about like history, really important history about racist ideas. But he talks a lot about that a lot of these racist ideas. The purpose of these ideas weren't, they didn't create them initially because they wanted to be racist. They created them because they wanted to justify different really horrible acts that people were profiting on. For example, like this transatlantic slave trade was started from Portugal. They were looking for a new source of enslaved people. They instead of getting them from the Slavic regions that were becoming more fortified and hard to get to, so they developed a slave trade from Africa, and they made an enormous amount of wealth, selling enslaved people to the Americas and to colonies. But they needed, a justification of just the brutality of this enslaved system and just how horrible this, the genocides and the ethnic cleansings and things that were happening. So what they did is they created these racist ideas. They created, they hired this author, to go down to Africa and record, a whitewashed version of the colonization, and then talked about how, what he did is he summarized all African people were one species and they were inferior and they were like beast-like, and they, didn't, they were uncivilized. And what we were doing is we were bringing them civilization through slavery. We were bringing them Christianity and all these different things. So so they created this idea of black, being, all black people were one species and it was a subspecies. And then they created that, and that spread all over Europe and then eventually spread to the Americas. And that's where we get this like anti-black racism. And that wasn't Portugal's idea, wasn't to be racist, that, they were looking for a way to just be, justify the amount of wealth that they were creating. So I want to talk about another concept that's very important when we talk about racism, and that's anti-Blackness. This is a great definition from a great Instagram account that I would definitely recommend following. But they wrote, anti-Blackness is the inability to recognize Black humanity. And there's a lot of great examples. I recommend, reading this and a lot of great, suggestions. But I just want to talk about kind of like where a lot of this comes from. We mentioned this a little bit before with the justification for European colonialism and making an enormous amount of wealth off of such a horrible systems like slavery and genocide. But also, Portugal, when they started the transatlantic slave trade in Africa, they actually hired a writer to go in. We'll talk more about this next class and the history of this. But his job was to kind of like whitewash what was happening and to write a book about how Portugal was actually civilized in Africa because they were all these beast-like subspecies, violent people that just needed slavery and European civilization to survive, and they were exported to Americas for slavery. And then during slavery though, it would have been dangerous having this idea that they're exporting all these dangerous people to the these plantations. So they came up with this new idea that stereotypes that Black people were docile, they were just like simple, not intelligent, so again, it came up with always like scientific racism and eugenics and stuff to kind of prove that they were inferior species. But then when the slavery was over, they quickly went back to this is the African stereotypes that black people were dangerous and criminals, and it had to be controlled through violence. And they did that because after slavery, white supremacy still wanted to maintain control, so they did that through terrorism, lynching, convict leasing, sharecropping, voter suppression, all these horrific things, but they also wanted to paint themselves as being in the right and have the moral authority. So they also brought in a lot of these horrible stereotypes. They basically, again, they criminalized. They created the myth of black criminality, that all black people were this dangerous species that had to be controlled through violence, had to be controlled through voter suppression, had to be controlled through convict leasing and other forms of slavery. And those mentalities and those stereotypes are still ingrained in all of our systems, and all that we internalize. And we create our criminal justice system was created in that moment, and it was created out of the idea that of black criminality. It was created to violently confront black people because because there was a myth that they were the criminals. And it was used when black people were moving in communities to scare people. Into white flight and to all these different things. So it's important to understand that anti-blackness, that inability to see black humanity and see it as this dangerous thing, is still in every single one of our systems. It's still in our schools. It's still in our criminal justice system. It's still in our employment. So we need to be, we need to understand the specific that racism, racism covers a lot of different people and a lot of different things, but there is also this anti-blackness, along with anti-indigenous culture that is still here, that was created in European colonialism and still here. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to say things like Black Lives Matter. It's important to support black businesses, and it's important to support black culture and things like that, as a direct denial to this anti-blackness that's so ingrained in our system. And that's really important. We have a lot of new language and terminology that's coming out. And it's important to kind of keep up to it because it can get overwhelming. But a lot of times we use the words people of color as this universal term, and sometimes it erases things as we use it as a universal term. Like when we're talking about police brutality, a lot of times we're not, there's black, when we say, people of color, especially in DC, people of color experiencing police brutality, it's not, it's erasing this. I mean, it's black people that are experiencing this brutality. It's indigenous people, Native people and black people are experiencing much higher rates of police brutality. So really, it's important not to make an effort to really identify that and not just use this blanket umbrella term that kind of erases a lot of this anti-blackness and anti-indigenous culture, and then when we use black, we want to capitalize that because we're not talking about a color, from a crown box. We're talking about a culture and people. And then there's this new term that's coming out, in the last couple of years. It's Black Indigenous People of Color, or BIPOC. And this is a powerful term. This is brought about to just recognize that, although all people of color are, experience, oppression from white supremacy, and we're going to have whole classes on Asian American, history of Asian American oppression and Latinx oppression and stuff. And we don't, we definitely erased a lot of that oppression, especially, what Asian Americans experienced in the beginning of this country on the West Coast. But at the same time, we have to, this term came about to kind of just recognize that, there is a anti-black and anti-indigenous part of this white supremacy, and it affects these people differently. So by using this Black Indigenous People of Color term, we're kind of capturing all of that as well. There's one comment. Abraham Lincoln, when considering what to do with a freed Negro, thought a lot about millions of black people living in our country, and commented that America would be in trouble if our chickens come to roost. For sure, I think we're, especially with the 1619 Project, we're learning a lot more about Abraham Lincoln, and yeah, he definitely had some pretty racist views as well. And then the last thing I want to mention before moving on to the next section is intersectionality. So just because that people are experiencing certain things from race and gender, there's a lot of identities that overlap that and make it even worse. So a Black person experiences certain things in this country, but a Black woman experiences racism and, patriarchy. Then a Black, poor woman, experiences classism, racism, patriarchy. And you have disabilities and sexualities, like Black transgender people, experience higher rates of violence and everything else. So we have to understand there's a lot of identities and they all wrap around, they all kind of add to themselves as well. Yeah. All right, so I'm looking at time. So this is going to be a long class. I'm just going to be honest. I think the intro was a little bit longer. I added some last second videos that are taking up some time. So again, like I said, I don't want this to be like a stressful thing. If you're feeling like you can't last too much longer, that's fine. We're going to record this. We'll send this out. We're just asking people to watch it. The rest of the classes beforehand. I do have some more. We're going to have some discussions and interactions during this next section or two. So we are going to. It's going to be a little bit more interactive. We'll have a break here soon after this intersection. But just going to give you a heads up. Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a much longer. This is probably going to be more closer to about 3 hours or so, just to give you a heads up. But like I said, yeah, if you want, I'm just going to go ahead and do it, and then whoever's with me is great. But I won't judge you if you gotta bail. So white fragility. So we're gonna watch a quick video on white fragility.
How do you feel when you see a headline like this? Or this? If you're white, you might feel uncomfortable, guilty, or even angry. In this video, we're going to talk about why that happens and how to overcome it. Most white Americans don't realize our culture protects us from having to truly confront racial inequality, which gives us a major blind spot when it comes to understanding what the reality of systemic racism is for people of color, or how complicit we may be in their oppression. We think of racism as something bad people engage in, instead of something we're conditioned into from childhood. As a result, when indirect, unconscious, or less obvious forms of racism and discrimination are exposed for what they are, it challenges our beliefs about ourselves and our world, provoking our own blind spots when it comes to race. And more often than not, well, let's just say we don't handle it well. The phrase was invented by Robin DiAngelo, a multicultural education expert, to talk about what happens consciously and unconsciously when white Americans are confronted with challenges to white dominance. According to DiAngelo, even a minimal amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves, including the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors wind up preserving the status quo, protecting white comfort, and therefore reinstating white dominance. White fragility is triggered by interruptions, in which white codes of discourse are broken to force a white person to confront racism, and they show up in a number of different ways. Like when anyone, white or otherwise, suggests that a white person's viewpoint is racist. When people of color talk candidly about their experiences of racism. When people of color choose not to share stories or answer questions about their racial experience. And especially whenever people of color choose not to protect the racial feelings of white people. Some other instances of racial stress include when white people are denied access to Black safe spaces or Black bodies. When white people are told their actions have racist impacts. When racial inclusivity gets prioritized over group membership. When double standards are exposed. When white meritocracy is challenged by exposing white privilege. Whenever white centrality is challenged by narratives in which people of color are front and center without being presented stereotypically.
And finally, when a person of color holds a position of leadership. Whatever the cause, knee-jerk overreactions protect white dominance by silencing non-white voices and segregating whites from people of color. By distancing ourselves from racially stressful situations and refusing to consider other perspectives, white people take advantage of the very race privilege we claim not to have. As long as white people require conversations about race to be comfortable for us, racial equality will be a lot harder to achieve. So what do we do when our rules stand in the way of dealing constructively with racism? The answer is, we break the rules. The best way to defeat white fragility is to grow a thicker skin. Build your racial stamina by following some do's and don'ts. Don't assume you are objective or an authority on the experiences of people of color. In a racialized society, whites inevitably have a blind spot. Resist the urge to get defensive when people of color speak honestly about their experiences. Catch yourself whenever you find yourself thinking that a Black person's perspective is divisive or abusive. That's often a sign that you lack understanding. Don't recenter a conversation or narrative involving race around you or your feelings. Instead, cede the floor to your neighbors of color to amplify and learn from their perspectives. Explore the complexity of individuals you disagree with or don't understand. Your realities are totally different, and you will never breach that divide by running away from or silencing uncomfortable exchanges. Before getting angry, think about the root cause or need behind someone's emotional outburst or complaint. What you're interpreting as impoliteness or vitriol may be the best available means for them to express their experience of racism. Remember, in this society, white people are safer, included, and seen by default. The same is not true for people of color, which is why forcing them to shoulder the burden of fighting for equality, requiring them to be friendly and helpful in the face of white ignorance, and expecting them to give white people the benefit of the doubt, is not only wrong but also makes well-meaning white people complicit in their oppression. Choosing not to be sensitive in a world that already shelters you will improve your racial resiliency, lead to better relationships with your Black and brown friends and neighbors, and most importantly, create necessary space for the equality and justice that people of color deserve.
The Rise District is a really great organization, puts a lot of content, great content together. So Dr. Robin D'Angelo, so she coined the term white fragility, but it's also good to understand too that people were talking about this stuff before she coined this term. It was just called white comfort or white discomfort, but she really has done a great job kind of adding to that. So she writes that white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. Socialized in a deeply internalized sense of superiority and entitlement that we are either not consciously aware of or can never admit to ourselves, we become highly fragile in conversations about race. So we experience the challenge to our racial worldview as a challenge to our very identities as good moral people. It also challenges our sense of rightful place in hierarchy. Thus we perceive any attempt to connect us to the system of racism as very unsettling and unfair moral offense. So I'm going to play a really quick video of Robin D'Angelo. She's going to give a little speech about the good-bad binary. I think we're a lot of our opposition to talk about race is because we've associated, racism as like, good people are racist, bad people, or, good people aren't racist, bad people are racist, when in reality, we've all were born into the system. We've all internalized this system. It doesn't matter about good or bad, but she talks about how this is like one of the biggest problems, hurdles. And unfortunately, I made notes, maybe this button, I made notes on where to start this slide, but they don't pop up on Zoom. So I think it's right about here. Just give me a second.
To say I couldn't possibly be racist, I don't do those things. Racist expressions, the KKK. But I want to I want to help. And of course, sketchy is very much associated.
Okay.
Where are the good neighborhood? Good language. So is through the power of segregation. Most convey that there was any loss.
Okay, I think it's.
And I'm going to repeat that because I think I can live my whole life and my good college and my good careers if my government saw us in the line of work.
I may have to.
That is what I call this system. But I am responsible for changing it because the deep is a form of action. One of the most effective adaptations of racism since the civil rights era is this idea of a racist is a bad person, and if you're not racist, you're a good person. What I call the good-bad binary. And we can all fill it in, right? So if you're racist, then you're prejudiced and mean-spirited and bigoted, ignorant, and Southern, and probably drive a pickup truck. So we got some classism in there, right? This is our racist. And if you're not racist, you're good and you're progressive and you're open-minded and you're educated and you're Northern. And this binary is probably the number one construct that keeps racism today in place and makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about racism. The defensiveness we have comes from this binary. What we hear is, you just said I was a bad person. And so this binary sets it up to be mutually exclusive. You cannot be a good person and be complicit with racism. So you'll notice in the news when racism gets talked about, they'll bring in the evidence they'll have to defend the person that's being accused of racism is, but he's a really nice person. Right? Because again, it's mutually exclusive. We have to understand racism as a system that we're all a part of. You know, I often, in my trainings, after I've kind of laid out kind of how racism works, I'll ask people of color, how often have you given white people feedback on our inevitable, unaware, and unintentional, but inevitable racism, and have that go well for you? And, you know, there's eye rolls and laughter, and basically the answer is never, right? It's virtually impossible for people of color to give us feedback because that binary sets us up to defend, right? I must, at all costs, deflect and establish that I am not racist, right? And that makes it so that we can't examine the reality of the society that we live in. And then I'll follow up and ask this question. So what would your daily life be like? This is a question I ask the people of color. If you could simply give us feedback when we step in it, which we inevitably will, and have us receive that with grace, reflect, and seek to do something different, what would your daily life be like? And recently, a man of color in the room, there was a pause, and then he said, it would be revolutionary. And I just want you to sit with that for a minute. Revolutionary, that white people would receive the feedback, reflect, and try to change our behavior. That would be a revolution. Returning to the pillars underneath the dock.
Okay. All right, so this takes us to our first group activity for people that are still with us. So I want to try to just map out, you know, so white fragility. There's a series of different reactions that people that white people will experience when they're called out or when they're associated with racism and things like that. And I'd love to kind of just ask the group, you know, what are, you know, some of these common reactions that you have? I mean, if you feel free to unmute yourself, but if you want to just, or you could type it in, but what are some of these reactions that you've seen, you know, maybe yourself or maybe other people have, you know, experienced when we're confronted with, you know, accusations of racism? So we got one, the Karen cry. Oh no, I was going to plan on writing on this, but I realized you can't do it on the slideshow. Okay, So Karen cries one. I'll write that down. Just checking out of conversations for sure. So like avoidance, one thing I get a lot of is like, I get like annoyance. People are just very annoyed that, they're like, oh great, Josh is talking about racism again. You can't wait, just enjoy ourselves and have a good time. So another one, Amanda said attacking tone of delivery. Yeah, so tone policing, which is a tough one, for tone, because a lot of times, black, like if you're a black person who's lost loved ones to police brutality, and then all of a sudden your white friend, posts something about Blue Lives Matter, like that, you're not going to deliver that in this calm tone, and that's a defense of white people. It's like, if it's not delivered in this, in the perfect way that I want, then I'm not going to listen to it. But then, when it is like, Colin Kaepernick, who is like protesting as peacefully as possible, is literally taking a knee, and you look at the reactions of that. But we also have, avoidance, being insulted that you would even say such a thing. Yeah. So, I get a lot of that, just like that bulliness, they just want, try to make it out like, like, I thought you were my friend, I thought you know me better, wanting to not feel defensive, blaming, uncomfortable, attacking wording or content of delivery. The eye roll for sure. There's a lot of our, 97% of our communication is nonverbal. So there's a lot of it when you're doing it in person. You get a lot of that. Even if they don't say it, they're physically communication. It's just it's very disturbing. Defending using my proximity. So you might have to elaborate a little bit more on that, Jennifer.
So proximity to Black people, relationships, like, I have a Black friend or a Black partner, or Black family member, or something like that.
For sure, definitely. Thank you. So Mary says, but I'm not like that, would never do that. Yeah, so again, it goes back to that good bad binary. Just because if I did something racist, I must be a bad person. I'm from New York. I have a Black friend. I'm poor. I don't see color, or I celebrate color, for sure. Yeah, definitely one. Yeah, the association. I have a Black friend. Or a Black person told me that it's okay for me to say, the N-word. So it must be good. We aren't the only country, place, people who do this, for sure. And a lot of that, I think a lot of times they get that they downplay it, like, like it's not that bad here, like it's so much worse in another country, when reality is, it is that bad here. It is, for sure. And there, when in defending Trump, Kellyanne Conway reminded us all that she is married to an Asian guy, for sure. I teach at a Title I school. Yeah, so you're teaching, so you must know what you're talking about. Yeah. For sure. Deliberately misinterpreting, Colin Kaepernick's protests, white exceptionalism, but I'm a good white person. I'm taking a white privilege class. Yeah, I get that a lot. A lot of conversations I get where, like, I took, there's a lot of, like, racial bias tests online, and those are good to take. Take those racial bias tests. But then I get people say, I can't be racist. I've taken all these racial bias tests. Like I've literally gotten that, for sure. So white, but you're different from those people, different social economic class, for sure. Thank you, everybody. Yeah. Yeah. So I think a lot of that, we get anything ranging from aggression, to just making it so uncomfortable that you don't even want to continue this conversation with them, to downplaying, victim blaming, victimhood, to good bad binary, to I thought we were friends, to I can't believe you think I'm like this person. So for sure, yeah, thank you all so much. All right, and so there's a really great Ali Henney is a great author, great activist, great person to follow on social media. She does a lot of great work, but she created this white fragility self-test, and it's a really fantastic test to take. again, like you're saying, we're not, and once you get past this, like, I'm not a bad person. I'm just was born in this white supremacy society. I'm internalized these things. And so it's a good thing to ask yourself these questions and try to see if there's some kind of, emotional reaction that you're getting from, or even physical. A lot of times, we physically, react to things. We may, our heartbeat may get faster. We may get, sweaty, things like that, so, but, I just highlighted a couple of questions, but I definitely recommend everyone kind of taking this test on your own time and just kind of, sitting with some of these feelings. But then one, do I feel defensive when a person of color says white people? Do I feel angry when people tell me that I benefit from white privilege? Saying not all white people or similar phrases make me feel better when someone calls white people out for something. For sure. I mean, that's something I hear a lot of, is when like a person of color or a Black indigenous person of color, tries, say something like, white people get, better home loans, or they get treated better by police, or they do this or that. And then someone's always said, well, not all white people. And even if you're not like consciously, doing this, what they're talking about is this system that benefits white people. So even if you're not the one consciously doing this, you're still part of this system. You're still part of, these benefits. So yeah, don't say not all white people, for sure. Do I think that racism would go away if people stop talking about it? Does being told that that something I say, think, or do, or otherwise value is racist make me want to shut down, leave, or express my discomfort? Or do I feel the need to prove that I'm not racist? Well, yeah, I definitely recommend everyone kind of take this test on your own. And then just a couple tips when you're approaching, like racism and conversations about racism and white privilege, and when you're being called out, try to approach this with humility, not ego. Try to build a tolerance to discomfort. Avoid that, don't feel shame, don't feel guilt. We've all been born in this. We all were taught this. It's not about, right or wrong, or who's good, a good white person and who's a bad one. It's about just understanding we're all part of this, and we all need to, do our, work on, understanding our internalizations and understanding how we dismantle these systems, avoid trying to be the good white person, and believe, Black, indigenous people of color's experiences. Reflect on their feedback. When someone gives you feedback, it's oftentimes it's because they actually care about you and they wanted to continue having a relationship with you. So they want to give you feedback, so, to let you know what they need to continue being your friend. A lot of times it's not just an attack, even though it may come out, harsh, but it's, we need to understand what's behind that, understand our reactionary feelings, and also just apologizing, not just apologizing, but also, working on course correcting, working on, trying to change, your react, appreciating that feedback. I taught this food justice course a little while ago, and we talked about, the different waves of xenophobic waves against Latinx immigrants, throughout the last century, because we created this food system basically, on the plantation system that needed exploited labor, and then when the Black people were free, there was convict leasing, and when that went away, we basically relied on cheap immigrants to fuel our food systems. And I talked about all the different movements. We have these movements where we need these workers, and then they and then something happens like the Great Depression, or veterans are returning from war, and then you can't find a job, or like Trump, and these different so then these immigrants are scapegoated, and then we have these massive forms of deportation and violence, and then we go back to, we need more labor, so we start it's just this ongoing phase. And there was this one, Eisenhower did this campaign, I'm not going to say the name, but it's Operation, I'll just say WB, and he deported like over 1 million immigrants. And I said the name, and the name was actually a derogatory name, term for Latinx immigrants, and someone in the class emailed me afterwards and told me about that and told me he felt very offended that I would say that out loud, and he's been called that all his life. And we had a conversation and we talked about it and how it's and now I don't say that out loud. I'll post it, but I'll say why I don't post it. But I mean that I felt like you can grow from these conversations from this stuff. So it's definitely if you could just get past that, it could be a really meaningful experience. There's one more video again, Francis Ramsey talking about how to actually apologize and oh man, I wish I had my notes on where to start this video. I think I'm
Hey guys, so today I want to talk about getting called out and how to apologize. And the thing that inspired this video is recently we've had a lot of celebrities in the media screwing up, getting called out, and then offering faux apologies, like Russell Simmons, Paula Deen, Anthony Weiner, most recently Cheryl Underwood. I wanted to talk about what you're supposed to do when you get called out and the way to apologize so that people believe you and know you're actually committed to change. When I talk about getting called out, what exactly do I mean? It's not just getting your feelings hurt or someone pointing out that you took the last slice of pizza. Getting called out in this context of this video is when you say or do something that upholds the oppression of a marginalized group of people. So for example, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, something that you've said or done that basically is just perpetuating negative stereotypes or ideals that have real consequences. So in my social responsibility video, we talked about why making jokes about really serious issues or minimizing serious issues has negative consequences. But now I want to talk about what happens when that's brought to your attention and how you can successfully apologize and become an ally and now be committed to changing your behavior and doing the right thing. Usually when you call out someone's behavior or something that they've said, the natural reaction is to get defensive. You're so sensitive. I was just joking. My best friend's Black. My sister's a lesbian. You are so emotional. You know I didn't mean it that way. Everybody has to be so PC nowadays. Now I can completely understand why people usually react this way. It's because no one wants to be the bad guy. And if you get called out on doing something that's oppressing another group of people, well, that's bad, and no one wants to be bad. But I want to discourage you from going that route because what you really need to do is listen, because this is where the other person is hopefully going to explain to you what you did wrong and how you can change it. Another thing that people tend to fall back on in these instances is their intent. Oh, I didn't mean it like that, or you're interpreting it the wrong way. In these instances, I know that you might think that that makes a difference, but we're not really worrying about your intent here because of course you didn't mean to offend anyone. There really aren't that many people that walk around trying to offend people. I mean, there are those people and they're jerks, and why would you want to be friends with those types of people? Your intent really doesn't matter because it's a matter of intent versus impact. And that's actually something I learned from a really good friend of mine, Jukebox Jones on Facebook. It doesn't matter in these instances what you meant. What matters is what's the outcome of what you said or what you did. I use the example of stepping on somebody's foot. I might step on your foot and break your toe. I didn't mean to break your toe, but your toe is still broken and it still really hurts. So instead of talking about what you meant to do, talk about what you actually did. Which brings me to the next part of this video, good apologies versus bad apologies. Now, the first most common bad non-apology that I hear, I'm sorry that you were offended. That is like the worst non-apology ever, because instead of taking responsibility for your actions, you're putting the blame on the other person and saying that it's your fault that you're offended, not that you did something that offended them. So don't make that mistake. Another one that I hear a lot of times is, I'm sorry if you were offended. That one doesn't cut it either because the person is offended. So there's no reason to bring up if, and it also doesn't acknowledge what you did wrong and why it was wrong, because you're saying if you were offended, I'm sorry, but if you weren't offended, I'm not sorry. And again, that's not how you do this apology thing. A real genuine apology is made up of two parts. The first part is you take responsibility for what you've done, and then the second part is you make a commitment to change the behavior. It's that simple, and trust me, as someone that's apologized more than a few times, as someone that's been called out more than a few times, it's not really that hard to do. The best way that I can figure out to drive this point home is to give you an example using myself. So about 2 years ago, I made this video called Queen for a Day, where I dressed up as a drag queen, went around New York City, and asked people to guess if I was a man or a woman. I thought the video was hysterical. My friends thought it was really funny. It did really well on YouTube. And it wasn't until about a year later that someone brought to my attention that it was super offensive. They were like, hey, this is some transphobic garbage. Why would you do something like this? Now, of course, my initial reaction was to get defensive. I was like, what are you talking about? I'm not transphobic. What does that even mean? I have friends that are trans. I didn't mean it that way. It's just a joke. You're taking this too personally. I did all of the things that you're not supposed to do. So instead, I stopped and I listened. And they explained that if you're trans, having people try to figure out what your gender is like a daily battle. And it's not really fun, and it's super rude. And making a video that encourages that and kind of makes a game or something funny out of questioning someone's gender is basically encouraging people to participate in that type of behavior. And that's really, really bad, especially when you consider the fact that there are trans people who are regularly assaulted and murdered because people are trying to question and figure out how they identify. So once this was brought to my attention, I was like, you're right. I'm so sorry. Didn't need to talk about what my intent was or why I did it. Instead, I just said, wow, I'm really sorry. I'm really going to make sure that I don't do that again. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. I ended up taking the video down, and since then I've really made an effort to be more aware of trans issues and try to be a better ally to the trans people in my life and in my online community. And it was surprisingly not that hard or life-changing to admit that I did something wrong. And it felt really good to know that I fixed the problem and that now I'm part of the solution. The first thing that you want to do is acknowledge what went wrong.
All right. So, all right. And the last thing I want to say, when you're actually, having these conversations, especially on social media, it's always good just to have a couple good memes when you just can't talk any longer. It's good to have a couple of this on hand. And this is when I post a lot on a lot of people's Facebook pages. It's good to have some good ones like this. All right, so we're going to go